Well, look at the reality they created.
You're listening to Behind the Headlines on the SOT Radio Network. The world for people who think.
Hello and welcome to Behind the Headlines on SOT Radio Network. I'm Neil Bradley. My co-host as usual, Joe Quinn.
Usual suspect. Hi there.
Thank you, Joe. Today we're speaking with Irish-American author and activist Chris Fogarty. Born in Chicago, raised in Ireland, Chris was an engineer by profession and toured the world, worked around the world on major engineering projects. He has spent years now investigating the truth about the Irish famine in quotes and runs a website where he exposed the truth that the deaths of millions of Irish people in the 1840s and 50s was a result of systematic policy by the British government to starve the so-called rebellious Irish. Chris has been a regular columnist for some 19 years for Irish American News. He runs the website irishholocaust.org and is the author of Ireland 1845-1850, The Perfect Holocaust and Who Kept It Perfect, in quotes. Now, British and US intelligence have tried to silence Chris because of his human rights advocacy on behalf of Irish Catholics in the north of Ireland, and of course his work to expose the truth about the so-called Irish famine. They've attempted to frame him for murder. We'll be trying to get his story from him later. Chris is the Chicago agent of the Irish National Graves Association, and is assisting the process of systematically installing grave markers across the island of Ireland for some of the hundreds of mass graves that are known to now exist. So, well, a very warm welcome to Behind the Headlines, Céad Míle Fáilte, to Christopher Fogarty. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Chris. I think we'll just start off with because it's a recently published, and I think it's a kind of like a culmination of maybe our part, and in a certain sense, a culmination of your work, at least on the Irish Holocaust. You just recently published a book, as Neil just mentioned, in end of last year. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and what's in it or what's behind it?
Yes. Well, first of all, in general terms, approximately 5 million people, Irish Catholics, were murdered between 1845 and 1850. But the killing did not stop then. It continued until Britain repatriated its landlords from Ireland. And nearly all of that was accomplished between 1900 and 1910. So the killing went on, and it was accomplished by the removal at gunpoint of Ireland's abundant crops, its grain crops, its livestock, its vegetables, its dairy products, poultry products, from the whole country, marched at gunpoint to the nearest port for export. And it was sent largely to England, but also to its army throughout its empire, and even to feed the black slaves of English planters in the Caribbean. There's quite a bit about that in the book by William Cobbett, a British MP at the time, who described that, and described that Irish food kept 250,000 refugees alive, loyalists from the northeastern part of the United States who fled the new revolutionaries. They fled the new America in order to remain British, and they fled to New Brunswick in Canada, and there they were kept alive by food from Ireland, according to this British MP, William Cobbett. So what this is an expose of one of history's worst genocides that has been kept covered up today. And the strangest thing about the Irish government is that, so far as I know, no other nation, no other government, I should say, on earth has ever deliberately and carefully and with great intent and with great detail concealed a genocide of its own people. I've never heard of such a thing until I learned. In fact, in going to school in Castlereagh, County Roscommon, the beautiful Maris brothers there, who did their very best with us, they lied to us. For the Brother Enda, my main teacher there, lied to his students for his entire 50-year teaching career by calling it famine and referring to it as somehow just something that was visited by God, a force majeure, just a problem, something that came upon the people. And something very important in this is that whenever one uses the term famine about any nation, it imputes to that nation, to the people of that nation, a stupidity. In the case of Ireland, the lie is that they grew only and relied upon only one failure-prone crop. There was nothing but potatoes from sea to sea. And that is a shocking smear of the people. They were murdered, and then in death, the 5 million who were murdered in death have been slandered, smeared, that they fell into a lethal trap of their own making. That is shocking.
Chris, just to backtrack a little bit here, I mean, just for our listeners, I mean, probably a lot of them will have heard about the Irish famine. And in fact, I think, that's the way as you've been mentioning, that's the way it's been officially recorded, even in Ireland, you know. I mean, one of the things I noticed was that your website, which is irishholocaust.org, you have a date, a year stamp on there of 1995. Was that when you first that's when you first published that information? But back in 1995, I mean, there was nobody, I think, in Ireland who had any notion whatsoever that the Irish famine was anything but what they were told. So it's actually quite amazing to me that 20 years ago you were talking about this, because it's only in recent years that I've kind of really, you know, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years that that's come on my radar. And I think in that period of time there's been a lot of stuff that has come out in general about history, etc. But how 20 years ago, what was the reception to this idea that, because just for our listeners, the official story is that at maximum 2 million people died in Ireland in this famine, which was just because all the Irish had to eat was potatoes, and there was a blight, and 2 million people died, and 2 million people fled.
The consensus is actually 1 million deaths and 1 more million emigrated.
Right, yes.
So 2 million total. Right,
2 million total, exactly. So, although, you know, they don't talk too much about it, it's just, you know, it was a famine, poor Ireland, that kind of thing. And this has been around, this is common knowledge in Ireland. It's kind of...
I went to high school in Ireland in the late 90s. And this was still what we were being taught. I was being taught this by Franciscan brothers, just like you were 60 years prior. So there was absolutely no change. And as far as I know to date, no change.
So back 20 years ago, when you produced this information or found this information and tried to spread it, what was the reception?
Well, the reception among Irish immigrants here in Chicago and in general Irish Chicagoans and Irish Illinoisans is that they knew this because there were mass graves. Every community has its own mass grave in Ireland. They still whisper about it. There are 4 in and around Castlereagh, County Roscommon. My wife and I just got a memorial over one of them, the one out in the country. But there are a few more at the workhouse. But the response was completely positive, except I noticed that everyone associated with the Irish Consul General here in Chicago, the Irish Consulate, they do not want to know. The Irish Consul General has gone around giving speeches in opposition to my work. The Irish government, once November 3rd became Irish Holocaust Commemoration Day about 15 years ago, and has been so in very varying groups. It's not entirely widespread yet, but it is in the United States, Canada, the Anglophone countries, Ireland, England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand. And it has been commemorated there, often by priests, often by masses, and sort of like a holy day of obligation. But that date was selected because it was on that date in 1845 that a delegation of 22 Irishmen went to Lord Heytesbury, British Lord Heytesbury, in Britain's Vice-Regal Lodge in Phoenix Park, to beg him to stop removing Ireland's food, and additionally to cease all distilling and brewing in Ireland in order to save the grain for the people. He read to them from a paper about potatoes and blight, which he poo-pooed. So, November the 3rd, there are 2 events commemorated on that day every year. One, the official beginning of the Irish Holocaust, and number 2, the beginning of the famine big lie that Lord Heytesbury promoted at the time. And the Irish government, for some reason, and I shouldn't say Irish, I should think Irish in quotation marks, the so-called Irish government have been working very hard against me. Once November, about 4 years ago, the Irish government got behind a taxi driver in Dublin, the name of Blanche, yes, who has set up some day in May, a meaningless day in May, to commemorate the starvation of Ireland. But of course, they're commemorating along with Lord Heytesbury a famine, a potato famine. The real date for the Holocaust of Ireland, what was really done, is November the 3rd. The result here in Chicago is that they stepped up. We tried to get it taught in the schools here in Illinois, and the Irish Consul General went around promoting potato famine now. She gave speeches everywhere regarding potato famine. And so my work was actually the first. My eyes were partly opened by Cecil Woodham Smith's The Great Hunger, written in 1962 or 3. And in it, she recorded, wrote about the food removal by 13 named British regiments. Had she not buried that under other contradictory, false statements, I would have known then that it was not a famine, but was a genocide. But she did. She buried it under many, many pages of contradictory information, claiming, for example, that one of the causes, a chief cause of the death in Ireland, is that women had forgotten how to cook anything but potatoes. So the problem was the problem was culinary deficiencies. Yeah. If it weren't a cover up of the murder of millions. And then she also said that no grain was grown anywhere, hardly anywhere in the west of Ireland. My book completely demolishes that by presenting the precise locations of every grain mill, every grain kill, every brewery, every distillery, every flour mill in the country. And she said there were none whatever in Sligo and Donegal. And in fact, those two counties have I believe the greatest number of grain mills and grain kilns of any county in Ireland. So she lied in her book, and why she did it, I don't know. I think maybe to get whatever little bit of truth she was permitted to get out. And she did name 13 British regiments, and she was smeared for the next 2 decades. Irish academia smeared her relentlessly. You might have heard, if you were going to secondary school at the time in Ireland or shortly after, you might have been in on part of the smearing campaigns because academia set about the destruction of her reputation. So what I did then, I then forgot about it and continued using the word we were taught in school, famine. Her book had not corrected that falsehood in my mind. So I was doing my grandfather's biography after finishing up a job in El Salvador, and went to the public record office in Kew outside London, because I've learned to be ashamed to say, was a career British soldier. His sister died between the family house and the local post office in Durrell, County Laois, looking for his army pay. He kept his siblings and perhaps his parents alive for some years, and he joined the army for that purpose. He walked from Durrell to Abbey Laois to sign up. He took the Queen's shilling. He participated in the destruction of the Aborigines in Australia. He was in the Maori Wars in New Zealand. He was in India. He marched along with 40th Regiment of Foot in the celebrations when Queen Victoria became the Empress of India in 1875. He retired in 1881, the very same year that the British government gave up the cat of nine tails as a means of military discipline. So all of that happened. So I was there and I found that his regiment, the 40th Regiment, in reading background on it, had been, when he was 5, 6, 7, and 8 years of age, my grandfather, the regiment that he later joined was removing the food at gunpoint from South County, Galway, to the port of Galway for export. And I said, this is, how can this be? I always was taught everywhere, the only word there is famine. How can this be? So I immediately studied further, and I eventually found that more than half of the British Army at the time, their entire Empire Army at the time, were in Ireland removing Ireland's food at gunpoint.
More than half.
It took more. More than half, yes. In fact, precisely, there's an error in my website that the book corrects, and it was precisely 67 British regiments in Ireland of a total of 130 total regiments in their Empire Army. So just slightly over half of the British Empire Army were in Ireland, removing its food at gunpoint, and that has been called a famine. It is absolutely shocking. So I got that information and I put it into a pamphlet and got it around. We were beaten up, my wife and I, passing them out at the Milwaukee Irish Fest back around that time, in the late 80s. And
beaten up by who?
She was smashing the... Pardon me? It was a security guard at the Milwaukee Fest smashed my wife in the mouth with a transceiver, like a brick at the time. They were big at the time. And she was spouting blood. I immediately shouted for the police and ran after him, but the police came. They were very, very close by. They soon came, put handcuffs on me, and then pushed me backwards, so I fell onto concrete on my handcuffed hands behind my back. They then pulled me up and brought us both, my wife still spouting blood. They took us to a guard shack for Milwaukee Irish Fest in Meyer Park along the lakefront in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And they held us there for about 4 hours until my wife's lips went down. It became swelled up like a baseball. And when she was down, they took us to the hospital. They treated our wounds. I was wounded as well as she by the police. She was wounded by a security guard. I was injured by the police. After a few hours in the hospital, we were fixed up, bandages and things on us, and the police took us to the local lockup in the middle of Milwaukee, and we weren't released until noon the following day. So and I was charged with some crimes also, but within a day or two, we received notice from Milwaukee that all charges were being dropped. And I sought legal assistance to sue them for it, but couldn't get anyone to do it. So that was one small item.
Yeah, there was no obvious link between you handing out these leaflets exposing the truth about what the British did in Ireland and the attack by the guard, right?
No, that was specifically his purpose, to stop us. As we walked by one of the officers and handed him one, he said, "You can't do that here." So I thought, who would say no if all he has to do is read it? So we continued distributing. Within about 3 or 4 minutes from them, my wife had her lips split open by this security guard.
Huh.
So it's specifically about what we were
behind that. Have you any idea what the...
Well, yes, of course. And in fact, while I was still locked up and they put handcuffs on me so very tight I was in agony, my wife was outside the door of this security shack, and the Irish Consul General came along. And she said to him, "You're behind this." Now, if he were innocent, he'd say, "Behind what?" He said, "No, I'm not." And went into the guard shack where I was held. So the Irish Consul General was behind it, or at least very, very much approving of it. He was there, one of the participants in the agony I went through at the result of the tightened handcuffs and and all the injuries. So that's the Irish Consul General. But later, we got a warning from a friend. In fact, I have a photograph here at the Marist Brothers School in Castlereagh, County Roscommon. There are 3 or 4 classes there all in one. And sitting directly in front of me, is a man by the name of Joe Doyle. We were the same age. Like me, he was born in the States. And his family went back and brought him with them when he was a child like me. And he phoned me and he said, "Chris, I got to talk to you." I said, "Okay, Joe, you're talking." He said, "I can't do it over the phone." I said, "Stop by." He said, "I can't talk to you there either." So I said, mystified, "Well, what do you want to do?" He said, "Meet me tomorrow morning at the Golden Flame restaurant up on Higgins Avenue in Sayre in the northwest side of Chicago." So we met him there the next day, my wife and I both, and he said, "Your lives are in danger." I said, "Joe, we don't have any enemies." He said, "Well, some of my FBI colleagues have been bribed and subverted by MI5, and they're planning crimes against you to silence you and the work you're doing." So I thought about that, and he gave a whole lot more detail, the form of the bribes, how it all happened, who bit and who didn't, and all, how many trips they took over to London and from there to Belfast. These are FBI agents. But I said, Joe, you're in law enforcement. We're not. What are you doing about it? He said, there's nothing I can do. I said, you swore an oath of office to uphold the Constitution at all times. You don't have an option. He said, it's all happening over my head. There's absolutely nothing I can do. So we thought, Mary and I, but we didn't communicate at the moment, but later we both thought the same thing. If he didn't know his own oath of office, it is more likely that he had his whole story wrong. So we sort of forgot about it. But a month or a month and a half later, there was a triple murder in Winnetka, Illinois, of people I'd never heard of in my life. And we learned later that I was framed for that by a signed murder investigation report. We have a copy of that. While we were facing charges of other equally bogus charges for which we were locked up in the federal lockup in Chicago, barely made it out on bail. $100,000 for me, $50,000 for my wife, and two others, Frank O'Neill, his house, the deed to his house, and another $10,000 for Tony McCormick from the north, Carrick Fergus. So we got out, however, after 3 days, barely made it. And we were almost denied it, obviously. The FBI did not want to allow us to get out on bail. By getting out on bail, we were able to hire lawyers and to defend ourselves. And had we remained in the federal prison, we would have gone, or to jail, we would have gone from jail to trial to prison and would never get out. But we did bail out after 3 days in the federal lockup. And 15 months later, on that second set of charges, we proved that the only evidence against us was an FBI audio tape that was scientifically proven to be criminally fabricated. Nothing was ever done to the criminals, and I wrote to the Judge George Lindbergh, demanding that he notify law enforcement about the crimes that were perpetrated in front of him in his courtroom. And he wrote back saying that as a judge in that courtroom, that he's not allowed to arrest anybody. So I wrote back to him, you have just completely misrepresented my demand, which I now repeat, that you notify law enforcement of the crimes that were perpetrated in front of you in that court, and decided the case number and the time and everything else. And he never answered the second one. So that is what we're faced with. We have the rule of law is very little better in the United States now than it was under British rule.
So, so what you're saying, in essence, is that just there was a random kind of murder committed in the U.S. and the FBI chose to fabricate evidence against you because you were active in promoting the truth about the Holocaust in Ireland and the British crimes in Ireland 150 years beforehand.
That is correct. And meanwhile, by the way, on the afternoon when the triple murder was found, the local police were all summoned together, and they were all asked by their commander to write down the name of any possible suspect. When the cards were collected minutes later, there was only one name on a number of the cards. There was only one name, and that was the name of the murderer. But the FBI agent Buckley arrived the next day, put himself in charge of the investigation, and prohibited the local police from pursuing the actual murderer. And at the time, there was a death penalty here in Illinois. I would have gotten the death sentence, being older and a member of in their mind, the terrorist IRA. I would have gotten the death sentence, lethal injection. But 6 months later, 6 months while he remained on the street in Winnetka, Illinois, the murderer saved perhaps my life, but certainly my freedom for the rest of my life. He saved me by blabbing through his FBI cover. So the FBI kept a murderer on the street, a triple murderer on the street for 6 months in order to do work for the British government.
Yeah. Well, wow. Why were you, when you say you were seen as a member of the IRA, that was just more fabrication?
Yes. In fact, the IRA almost certainly would never allow me to join, because to be a member of an organization, you must commit to it. And I'll never commit to any organization, because to become a member of a group, you tend to become a salesman rather than an analytic. You tend to find everything that's good about that group and to deny anything that's negative. So they would never have allowed me to join. But it was a means by which, you see, they could dirty up the jury pool in the Chicago area.
Yeah, and make it look like you may well be a killer type thing. If they can smear you as an IRA member, then it's more plausible that you maybe were responsible for this triple murder.
Yes.
Go
ahead,
Chris. It sounds like there's a pattern. I mean, we're talking now about the 1990s, right? 80s.
Yes.
Late 80s.
Or late 80s. Okay. Of course.
Early 1990s. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Just before the so-called peace process in Northern Ireland. Well, it sounds like there was a pattern. This is just background for our readers. There's a pattern of both British and U.S. Authorities clamping down on anyone they perceived as being a threat to their designs. I mean, which have always been the case in Northern Ireland. So you would have been caught up in, as a quote-unquote prominent activist on behalf of Irish people and their history, you were probably caught up as part of a general kind of observation against anyone was
rocking the boat.
Yeah.
Yes, there were a number of people. There was the Brooklyn Five, including a wonderful man from Nina Tipperary. He died at about 94 years of age, maybe 10 years ago, Michael Flannery. There were 5 of them charged with sending weapons to the IRA, except that they had been sending weapons. In fact, a comical result of it is that it was a turning point in the trial against them. They were all released. They were all vindicated. But their position was, you have charged us with sending weapons to the IRA for the last 5 years. We have been sending weapons to the IRA for the last 20 years. And we did so with the assistance of the FBI and the CIA. It was their weapons that we sent to Ireland.
That's why it's always a murky game to go that far with such organizations, because they're riddled and controlled ultimately
from the outside.
From the outside. From the very enemy.
So what happened? So there are quite a few Irish in the FBI, but under Thatcher and Reagan, she was able to convince Reagan to completely turn against the IRA, and so a lot of Irish Americans sort of think that the United States government is generally on the side of the Irish in general terms, and they're not. And it's more, they cannot be, because, as Tip O'Neill says, when he was betrayed by U.S. Irish ambassador to the United States, Sean Donlan, who came out here again on a specific visit to stop Irish American support for the Birmingham Six, and that kind of thing. In fact, he was here. Two priests came out looking for justice for the Birmingham Six, and Sean Donlan, the Irish ambassador to the United States, contacted U.S. Congress members while they were in the air, telling them they would be arriving, and to not meet with them. And so he succeeded. The 2 priests went back, Father Raymond Murray and Father Dennis Fall came out here, and they couldn't get any politician to meet with them. It took something like 16 more years to finally undo that bit of injustice against the Birmingham Six. They were tortured, as you know, into signing confessions. But meanwhile, during our 15 months of our pre-trial litigation in Chicago, in defending ourselves against these MI5 FBI crimes, our lawyers got an anonymous tip to go to the Winnetka Police Department and have a look at the Langard murder investigation report. They did that, and in fact, the tip has to have come from that police station, because they very generously and promptly gave them photocopies of the signed police reports that framed me for those murders. So then our lawyers then had a whole lot. They had proof that the evidence against us was a criminally fabricated audio tape, and then a previous frame-up of murders for which the murderer was being convicted in those very days. And so they couldn't. There was no way they could possibly win this. So the U.S. prosecutor pled U.S. Judge George Lindbergh to please allow him to abandon all charges against all four of us. They then tried to infiltrate us again, the same FBI agent, through a David Rupert, a lifelong criminal from upstate New York, and he did get our leader, the wonderful old man who trusted everybody from outside Belfast, to meet with him in private, and they tried to get him to buy weapons for the IRA. By that time, we knew, even if we wanted to, we knew that it was a ticket to jail. So we would have a vote on it, Friends of Irish Freedom, and we would have a vote on it, and it would be Frank, yes, and everyone else, no. Then the same thing for a few weeks. So Frank dropped out and formed his own unit that was headed by this MI5 FBI mole. After getting little done here, because he wasn't very successful, the frame-up artist, the FBI agent Patrick, quote, Edward, unquote, Buckley, went to Ireland in 1994 along with Rupert, and they remained there until the evening of August 15th, 1998.
The Omagh bombing.
Yes, that ended their mission in Ireland.
Yes, that name Rupert's... The name Rupert's familiar. He was an FBI informant, yes?
He was on the payroll of both the FBI and MI5.
Right.
Yes. Once we learned that they were going to be framing Michael McKevitt for Omagh, we had experience with Buckley, of course. He had made 2 attempts against me, one against my very life, and locked us up and did use the system to the extent he could to railroad us. So we thought we had never known or heard of Michael McKevitt, but we said we owe him the kind of defense that we were able to muster in our own behalf against these criminals. So we went up to upstate New York, my wife and I, and we went to that is David Rupert's home ground where he was born and raised. He's not a Mohawk Indian, as he said, and that gave him entree to various groups, including in Ireland, by the way. And he ran a pub, the Dow's Inn pub, on the Leitrim shoreline, which is only about, I don't know, half a mile long or something, on the Atlantic coast, and for you as a front for the FBI. But he was a lifelong criminal, according to a New York State affidavit that was introduced into the trial of McKevitt. And we brought back, and I sent over 4 fraudulent bankruptcy filings by Rupert. And he told the court in Dublin that one of those filings was because of an accident of one of his trucks, except that his bankruptcy filing was 2 weeks before the truck accident. Anyway, we talked to numerous people. I talked to the main truck repair garage in Messina, New York, just about on the St. Lawrence River, way up north. He claimed a Messina, New York record that he was the only person in Messina's history to ever do business with David Rupert without being defrauded. And he proudly announced that record, that he was the sole one who had ever managed that. So, anyways, Rupert was over in Ireland, and they were framing McKevitt, and I hadn't seen Mary and I attended that trial in the special criminal courts on Green Street in Dublin, and we saw what was going on. We were staying in a guest house in Howth, and every evening we'd watch television. Every morning we'd buy the newspapers, and we were wondering what is wrong with Ireland's news media. They're not seeing what we're seeing in that courtroom. But there's nothing we could do about that. It was just shocking. And the charge against Michael McKevitt was not the murder of 29 people, but that was worked in to the reporting on it, to where the first sentence would be about the trial, the second sentence would be, and his organization murdered 29 people in Omagh. And so publicly, that's what he was being tried for. But in the courtroom, it was something different, membership. But again, the public were being fed this falsehood by the news media, and that's what stuck. So we were there, and we hadn't seen FBI agent Buckley in exactly 10 years since the last day we saw him was in court when we defeated him in federal court in Chicago. The next time we saw him was on Green Street, the special criminal courts room on Green Street in Dublin, and we were shocked, of course, to see him, and so blatantly.
What was his interest in the case? Why was he there?
He was there for MI5 in order to drive home the Good Friday Agreement, to demonize the in the same way that the Langert murders were blamed first upon the IRA and then me. Their murder, MI5's murder of 29 people in Omagh, was blamed upon the IRA. It was an IRA bomb, but the massacre was MI5 with the help of the FBI.
That's right. It later emerged that they knew a bomb-laden car was headed for Omagh, and they just let it happen.
Well, the owner of the car, Paddy Dixon, was an agent of the Irish government. So the Irish government were involved in that crime along with MI5 and the FBI.
Right. They were going to go out with one big last atrocity and then just kill totally demonize anyone having any association with the IRA and Sinn Féin for that matter. And that basically heralded the end of, I think at that point,
of the armed resistance,
Yeah, that was the end of it.
It turned public opinion against it.
Absolutely,
it was a public opinion coup for them.
Well, we talked with Michael McKevitt's wife, Bobby Sands' sister, Bernadette, and they were under very severe threat of death at the time. They were being killed by their neighbors. It was a very, very serious situation. She had a little business there in Dundalk and lost that, and it was a very, very dire and very dangerous situation for them. But they got away with it. A little aside here. While giving testimony on Green Street in Dublin, and by the way, in the same courtroom where 200 years to the week, or to the month at least, Robert Emmet was framed or sentenced to death and beheading by Lord Norbury in that self-same room. So it's a historic room, but another main frame-up is going on. And by the way, the difference between the trial of McKevitt in that courtroom and the trial of Robert Emmet in that courtroom 200 years earlier is that in his speech from the dock, Robert Emmet denounced the trial, that the jury had been selected to convict him in advance. That was decided in advance to that jury. But in Michael McKevitt's case, there was no jury at all. He was not allowed a jury because the juries, they might have told the truth. So they used a three judge court trial. And here in Chicago, when the trial was already set and Rupert had come back here, he was getting two newspaper reporters to write a book financed by Lord Black, who owned the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper at the time. Lord Black had just come out of prison about a year ago after serving about 5 years for his crime.
Conrad Black. Yeah.
Conrad Black, exactly, yes. So it was mentioned by at an interview when they were taping him. Aren't you concerned that your background will not allow you to give evidence in any trial in Dublin? And Rupert replied, my evidence my testimony or even any evidence won't make any difference. It was the state that selected the judges to hear the case, thereby impugning them, destroying the reputation of the three judges that he knew the fix was in. And that was read into the faces of the three judges. Wow. And about a week and a half later, those three judges said that he was that Rupert was a very credible witness.
My God, well, they were stupid as well, then.
They bent over backwards to facilitate having this. Well, they call Rupert a supergrass. So, he's a criminal, a known criminal, but he's a good guy who works for us. You can trust everything he says.
Well, it's important to mention here that during his testimony, David Rupert, on the witness stand, said that he was left alone in Ireland for a brief while Buckley left him alone in Ireland for that while Buckley flew to the Atlanta Olympics bombing murder site. Now, that was the Atlanta Olympics was in 1996, so they were in Ireland all those years, extending through 1996, at which time Buckley, the FBI, left Ireland to go to Atlanta. And there you might know that there the FBI framed another innocent. And Buckley, having been the expert in framing people and evidence fabrication and perjury, probably led that frame-up. They framed the security guard who had noticed the backpack on the ground and gotten as many people away from it as he could. One was killed, but he was a hero. But Buckley came along and framed him also. It hadn't gone to court, but he got the news media to make it seem to publish the lie that the security guard was the culprit. The security guard later sued the local newspapers for defamation and collected a few $1 million, but died very young, very soon thereafter. And by the way, being framed by the FBI does seem to be a life-shortening experience. That security guard died in his 30s, and one of the four of us, Tony McCormick, died at 51. And, of course, Frank O'Neill was older, but he died. So Mary and I, my wife and I, are the only survivors of the so-called Chicago Four who were framed. I was framed twice. She was framed once. We were both incarcerated and barely made it out on bail. So all of that has to do with telling the truth that is not wanted. I could never understand why the FBI would be involved in the murder of 29 people. I know they managed to pin it on the IRA and therefore wipe out the IRA in Ireland. But only very recently, just last year, did I find what seems to be the reason. And that is, there's a book published, Voices from the Grave. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I've heard of it, yeah.
By Ed Maloney. And in it, it's essentially a book contains two interviews. One of Brendan Hughes, so-called Darky Hughes from Belfast, and the other of David Irvine, the head of the Ulster Volunteer Force, the main terrorist killer group in Ireland. Murdered many hundreds of people, all Catholics, of course. David Irvine was brought in triumph to the White House in 1994. Now, being brought in triumph to the White House in itself is a statement by our government. And while there, he said what many loyalists tend to believe. He was talking to the U.S. State Department head of the Britain desk, and he complained to that person, the head of the Britain desk, that the United States government is in favor of the provos. And the head of the Britain desk replied, and I'm coming very close to the exact quotation, no, we don't. The IRA don't. If I said FBI a minute ago, I meant IRA. The IRA do not have Buccaneer bombers. They do not have aircraft carriers, and we, the United States government, must sew up the British exchequer so we can use the British forces in our upcoming wars. And the next sentence is by David Irvine, and we all looked at him. And he said, quote, Islamic fundamentalism. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places out there were all being planned as early as 1994. And by the way,
Wow.
Irvine ends up saying, David Irvine ends up saying, that was 1994, and I was not alone. There are other witnesses. By David Irvine. I hate to quote a serial murderer, especially one that is being championed by a government, but I'm doing so in this case.
That's amazing, but it actually fits very well with what we've thought before. Is that in the early 90s, the U.S. government, the U.S. intel agencies basically started to develop the Muslim terrorism or Islamic terror threat, etc. In preparation for a long-planned invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's very interesting because it makes sense as well. But I hadn't heard it before. What you've just said, which is that the peace process in Ireland, which occurred in the mid '90s, and then eventually, it became real towards the end of the '90s, and just before the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. That they did that specifically, that the U.S. government was specifically was pushing that, the FBI was pushing that peace process in Northern Ireland, like you said, to free up British military resources and monetary resources to engage in the war on terror, quote unquote.
Yes, all of it is a criminal war. It's an expansion of the U.S., UK, Israeli empire, and it is shocking.
So the only reason there's been a peace process in Ireland potentially is because they had these plans for a world war, basically a war on terror, a never-ending war on terror. Wow.
Yes, that is the case, and the signing over of the disputed 6 counties to the British government is the greatest transfer of national territory in history. Without, except in cases of catastrophic military defeat. Mm-hmm. And as you know, the IRA were not militarily defeated. They were betrayed from within, but they were not militarily defeated. And you wonder, why would the Irish government do this? So we've noticed here that the Irish government has been on the British side of every single issue that has involved Irish America. The Birmingham 6, we were told by the Irish Consul General, terrorism, don't talk about Birmingham, terrorism. So dissuaded us. We didn't know enough about it. We had heard there was an injustice, but we didn't know enough about it, so we backed off. Same thing with the Guildford 4. Then, once the Irish were first allowed to vote, all the general suffrage in the north, where they were allowed to vote in the 6 counties, and that the British government responded by getting employers to not hire Catholics, which means Irish and indigenous Irish people. Mm-hmm. Irish America responded by requiring at least the U.S. companies operating there not participate in that job denial program. Mm-hmm. At the time, 25 U.S. companies employed 11% of the working population of the 6 counties. So New York started, I think Boston, Massachusetts, we followed. So we were the 4th, Illinois was the 4th state to get it passed. It took just about 2 years to complete here. It required 60,000 signed letters, and all directed to the different politicians where they were. And then we did the same thing when it became a federal issue. Right. But at all that time, let me say, Illinois State Representative John McNamara described the situation as betrayal from the most unexpected quarter of all. And that was the Irish Consul General showing up in our state capital to speak against enactment. While Irish Illinois, to a person, was entirely in favor of enactment, the Irish Consul General stood with the British Consul General in opposition to enactment. They did the same. They worked harder at stopping the Chicago City Council vote on it, on a separate municipal ordinance situation. we have a budget here. The Chicago City government has a budget of $7 or $8 billion a year, and they wanted to make sure that corporations involved in denying of jobs to Catholics of the North do not participate as bidders on those contracts. So that was important. So we got it enacted here in Chicago, but the Irish Council was involved in all overtly sabotage, working with saboteurs, everything to stop it. We defeated them.
That's amazing. Just to explain exactly what you're talking about here, you've been kind of instrumental in the past in pushing through legislation in the state of Illinois, but this has happened in other states, that would require U.S. corporations that have bases or operations in Northern Ireland to not engage in discrimination, kind of like an apartheid South Africa, essentially. It was demanding that U.S. corporations in Northern Ireland do not engage in religious discrimination against Catholics, for example. And the Irish government, this is a Republican, supposedly Republic of Ireland government, was fighting against that. They were actually lobbying for discrimination against what was effectively their own citizens in the north of Ireland.
That is correct. It stuns, it boggles the mind, but that is the reality. They cannot deny it. We have copies of the transcripts.
And they were doing that at the behest. They were doing it at the behest of the British government, obviously, and that just makes it clear that the Irish government has, like you've been saying, has always been just basically a quizzling of the British.
Yes, we didn't. It only became clear to us slowly when, without exception, they were working against us, and in favor. And when all these crimes are being perpetrated against us, and I'm an Irish citizen as well as U.S., the Irish government was very much on the side of the FBI against us, and so. In other words, they were operating in conjunction with criminals against people who are doing the right thing. We were doing what all good citizens should be doing everywhere. Many people don't have the time. When I was working 40, 50 hours a week, I didn't have time. After things slowed down and I retired, we had time and we went to work. It was something that people of conscience must do. And the Irish government was with the criminals, with the British government all the way through. They framed Michael McKevitt using by the way the self-same evidence fabrication and perjury that we defeated here in federal court in Chicago was successful against Michael McKevitt in a Dublin courtroom. Maybe just
to because I'm aware that some of our listeners may not understand the kind of the context about of the situation that we're talking about, or in terms of what goes on in America in terms of support for what has gone on in the US in terms of support for the IRA and Irish republicanism. You were a member of Friends of Irish Freedom, which is one such group which basically supports supported the struggle of the Irish people in the north of Ireland and elsewhere for freedom, for a united Ireland. And that was a direct threat. That kind of a process, and people involved in that in the US were seen by the British as terrorists, because obviously they labelled the IRA as a terrorist organisation, when in fact they were simply they were effectively a guerrilla army of indigenous people fighting against foreign state occupation of their country. So
yes, you wonder how did the British manage to call them terrorists when the body count is there for anyone? The homicide records are there, available for anyone to see, which contradict that statement.
Right.
Anne Cadwallader, you might be familiar with her book Lethal Allies, just written
Absolutely.
last year or the year before.
Book, yeah.
Well, 120 random Catholics were murdered by a single gang named the Glenanne Gang, named Glenanne because that is the townland wherein an RUC officer has his farm. And the Dublin Monaghan bomb cars the bombs were primed in the RUC's farmhouse in Glenanne. So all of this is available, and why would the people of Ireland allow their own patriots to be locked up in Portlaoise?
Yeah.
And also McGabbery. Why? How can this be?
Yeah. So What was I going to say?
I think the answer to that question is they've been so heavily brainwashed. I mean, the topic we started with this show, they don't know their history. Mm-hmm. They don't understand that they never really got freedom. They got a simulation of it in 1920, and they've been under occupation ever since.
It must be said here that while the Irish were freed of their English landlords by about 1910, and certainly by 1920 they were essentially all gone, the rest of that establishment were left in place. The banks remained ascendancy, the insurance companies, the stock brokerages, the advertising agencies, the news media, they were all left in the hands of their enemies.
Right.
And they seem to be continued to be in the hands of their enemies.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been clear to me, looking at Irish history, that the long, horrible involvement and occupation of Ireland by the British, you can say it's 800 years. I mean, you can't be occupied by a foreign power for that long without really the full infrastructure and the essentials of the infrastructure of that country being infiltrated by that foreign state. I mean, it would be by 1920, 1922, it would have been almost impossible for any new Irish government or the Irish people to get rid of 700 years of British influence. It was so woven into the fabric of the state that I can't imagine how they would ever have gotten rid of it.
Well, if you're opening up something that's got to be addressed, and that is what we have in Dublin. What the Irish people have is a royal Dáil. Mm-hmm. That government, the current government, is the successor to one that was set up in 1922-3 by King George V. That is his royal Dáil that is operating. And this has only become clear to me recently. The government of Ireland, of, by, and for the people, was set up on Ireland's Independence Day. And Ireland's Independence Day is January 21, starting in 1919. That government was formed, Dáil Éireann was formed as a result of the island-wide election of 1918. Mm-hmm. That was a landslide for the Irish people, for Sinn Féin. Based upon that election, the winners formed the government. The British government promptly declared the elected government of Ireland an illegal assembly and set about assassinating and imprisoning that government.
Right, because it was democratic.
Exactly. A few years later, they imposed another Dáil on Ireland, and that is the royal Dáil. And what Ireland, it seems to me that anyone with any knowledge these days ought to be referring to the government of Ireland, the current government, as the royal Dáil, because it is the royal Dáil. And that helps to get people to understand the activities. And it might not be too noticeable in Ireland, though it should be, with the allowing the banksters to go in and loot the country and then force all of their losses onto the Irish people, taxpayers, and the water charge and everything. All of that, it should be even clear to people in Ireland. But in foreign areas, what the Irish consul generals have been doing are so blatantly treasonous to their own country that it's quite clear here. Except it is clear here to everyone except those who have a personal interest in keeping the lie going. And I'm afraid we have a little bit of that in this country also. The people associated with the Consul General of Ireland, with the Irish consulate, who remain closely connected, they're all on the make. They're all looking for number one.
Yeah, sadly, I think that's the absolute truth of the matter.
So the Irish Republican Brotherhood, I've only noticed them in the last year or two. And look at their site, the Irish Republican Brotherhood's website, and that of Billy Maguire, one of its chief spokespersons. They're doing wonderful work in advancing the interests of the people of Ireland by calling for a restoration of an Irish Dáil Éireann. It is absolutely reasonable, and you wonder how can people not hear of this and not act immediately. Starting last January 21st, they were not allowed to have their celebration in the Mansion House. I think it was a Mansion House in Dublin. They were stopped at the door. So, but because the reason the people of Ireland don't know about it, the news media do not want them to know about it, because the news media remain, including Radio Éireann, RTE, remain in essentially Anglo hands, the ascendancy hands.
Yeah, that's the sad truth of the matter, and it explains a lot of what has gone on in Ireland over the past
But the Irish Republican Brotherhood, I do believe, have the peaceful, reasonable, intelligent response to the current situation. If it's okay now, I'd like to go about this, the starvation of Ireland, our main purpose here.
Yeah, let's go back to that, because let me just frame that again. So, what you've just recounted about your harassment at the hands of the FBI and MI5 was because of your support, you and other people in the US, during the period of the so-called Troubles, your support for Ireland, the Irish fight for freedom in the north of Ireland, and your support for the IRA and your support for republicanism in general. And also, as part of that, you were obviously investigating, you had started on this path of investigation of the so-called famine. And I suppose from the point of view of the British, those two things were the same. If you support the Irish independence, then from Britain, digging up history and telling the truth of history about British involvement in Ireland goes back. The perfidy goes back a long way.
Yes, in fact, it has been a non-stop genocide with 3 peaks of genocide: one under Queen Elizabeth, one under Cromwell, and one under Victoria. And what's going on in the north today is a modified form of genocide. But to have withheld jobs, to have withheld livelihoods from the indigenous people is a shocking act. But at the time of the invasion, the population of Ireland was about 2/3 of the neighboring island, and now what it is 1/10 of it or so.
Yeah, less,
7 or 8% of it. Yes, so there has been a successful genocide carried on all these centuries, and it is time for the people of the strange thing about it is that I think that the people were more knowledgeable 100 years ago than they are in Ireland than they are today.
Yeah,
because they haven't. Yes, and the Catholic Church, I'm very sorry to say, there are a few heroes like Father Micheál O'Flanagan, but he was gagged by his church for telling the truth. He was sent into remote parishes in the back of beyond, and was gagged by his own church.
You mentioned, it goes back to the Elizabethan era. The British, obviously, Ireland is an island, a separate island off the coast of Britain. And the British have for a long time, since maybe 1200 or so, their interest in Ireland as a colony essentially began. But there was, and obviously the Irish resisted that, as any indigenous people do. They resist a kind of abuse and colonization and enslavement, effectively, because the British have, throughout their history, have been extremely good at enslaving and abusing indigenous people for their own benefit. So Ireland was no different. So the Irish people resisted that, as you would expect any normal people to. And the British developed different strategies, and eventually, and they had a lot of scope to really get their fingers into Ireland because it was so close. I mean, it may be slightly different in other far-flung parts of the empire, but Ireland really got the brunt of it because it was so close. And in doing a bit of research on this myself, on the famine, there was a letter that I saw quoted in a book. It was from 1601, and it was a letter from the Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir Arthur Chichester, to Lord Burleigh,
yes. who I know what you're going to say. He's calling for famine.
Right, who's Queen Elizabeth's chief advisor. And he said, I have often said and written, it is famine which must consume them, the Irish, our swords and other endeavours work not that speedy effect which is expected for their overflow. So he's basically saying we need to starve these people to death because killing them with swords and stuff and fighting them isn't doing the job fast enough. And this was in 1601, 250 years before the supposed time.
A little comment upon the destruction of those years. A little over a year ago, I was at a local book sales, and I picked up the oldest book, I believe, in the whole show, and the title of the book is Discovery of the Tomb of Ollam Folla, Ireland's famous monarch and lawmaker upwards of 3,000 years ago, by Eugene Alfred Conwell, MRIAMAIFR, Historical Society, etc., and Inspector of Irish Schools, printed in 1873. In the preface to it, he mentions that he refers to the Annals of the Four Masters to a certain extent, and in it he said that one of them survived and moved to Ballycroy, County Mayo, where he died in 1660 something. He died there, leaving his only treasure, his books, to one of his sons. His name was Cocogri O'Cleary. He had a second given name of Peregrine. He was one of three brothers, and in addition to a Mulconnery, who sat down in the convent of Donegal in 1632, and until 1636, they wrote the entire history of Ireland. They sat down to do that, faced with what they believed to be an entire wipeout of the Irish nation, its people, its customs, everything. There'd be nothing left of Ireland. And they wanted to leave a record of what used to be Ireland behind. That book was later called, or books were later called, the Annals of the Four Masters. Mm-hmm. So I happen to have the Irish telephone books here of 2000 here. And so I looked through them for an O'Cleary in Ballycroy. There are no O'Clearys anywhere in Mayo, but there are Clearys. And so I the first dial was Martin Joseph Cleary in Ballycroy. And I explained to him about what I found in this book and about his relative. And it's important to say here that by the time they finished the book in 1636, and then he died in the 1660s, that it was somewhere in between then when he fled to Ballycroy. But in the intervening period, Cromwell was there, 1649-52, and so he fled Cromwell at the time, and so in Ballycroy. So I said, "Here's this man," and he moved to Ballycroy. Are you, by any chance, a relation, a descendant? He said, "No, we don't know." He said, "We've often heard we might be, but there's no proof." I said, No historian or school teacher, no one else has ever inquired of you?" He said, "No, never." He said, "We don't know." Well, I said, "This just for your information. This man's name was Cocogri, and his second name, a given name, was Peregrine." Well, he said, "I have a cousin, Peregrine, who left here shortly after the Second World War and went overseas." Well, I said to Martin Joseph, "You have just established that you and all your cousins in Ballycroy are descendants of one of the Four Masters." And that's the reality. I put into my column in the Irish that I write in the Irish American News. It was delight to know that one of the four had survived, and that they had sat down to write the history of Ireland, lest it be entirely wiped out by the British.
So we've established that the British had an intent as far back as 1600 to starve the Irish, and in this ensuing couple of hundred years, there were various famines along the way, and I think that was part of the process of the colonization of Ireland, where a lot of the foodstuffs were being taken out of the country, and British landlords were coming in, English landlords were coming in and stealing all of the land and making peasants of the people. But it wasn't until this so-called famine period that everyone knows about in around 1845 that the British really seemed to go at it with a vengeance.
Yes, the English landlord, Lord Ashbrook, who evicted my great-grandfather and his family from Ballykeely, Doro, County Laois. his great-grandson lives in his castle in Arley Hall, Cheshire, England, today. So the notion that these, by the way, the notion that these were Irish landlords is really comical. It is really a laugh. Though a few were allowed during the Elizabethan period and before, only 4 families in Ireland or clans were allowed personal, legal personhood. The entire Irish nation were stripped of legal personhood. They were murderable at will by any English person, and it did not involve the law because, in fact, murder requires that the victim be human, and the Irish were not legally humans at the time for a couple of 100 years in their own country. So that's what they were faced with. So anyways, back to the book. Or in fact, back to the fact of the matter, it went on, and people there are mass graves all over Ireland. You might know where there are some yourselves, do you?
Not really, actually, because that in itself has also been downplayed massively by the Irish government.
That's true. That is true. In fact, in the years I was over there, we lived out what is called the Workhouse Road out of Castlereagh, and I walked by twice a day and did not know that there are tens of thousands of people buried there. Later, in going back and having learned about it, and I only learned about it in the Public Record Office in Kew outside London. That's where I learned the facts of the matter, and they're there available to everyone. I tried to get my old classmates in Castlereagh to put up a memorial over one of the workhouse mass graves. And there was initial great interest and enthusiasm. But in a very short time, that became very negative, and they're under pressure from others, and I don't know who those others are. They must be politicians. But my closest buddy and classmate had become an excavation contractor in the meantime, and he was the excavation contractor for a development of houses atop the mass graves of the workhouse in Castlereagh. And he told me, but he semi-whispered to me, didn't want people hearing, that when he was excavating, he was excavating the baby's graveyard. And he said they were all jammed together, all piled in on top of one another. And he said, we dug them up and moved them away and dumped the soil somewhere else. No. But the word got out. Maybe he helped to spread the word. I don't know. The scandal grew, and the development reduced the number of houses, so that there are 3 sort of small football fields on the development that won't be built upon, where the bodies were too thick to continue removing. But he still, I felt, was haunted by what he saw of the little toddlers' bodies all jammed in together, piled in on top of one another, all jammed together, that he dug up with a backhoe.
Amazing. Chris, just talk to us about the figures, because we mentioned at the beginning of the show the official figures is 1 million dead and 1 million fled from Ireland, but you have uncovered something else as far as the actual death toll. Yes.
In fact, the book I wrote is my writing, and the evidence all comes from official records, but the population loss, the murder toll, was written by an Irishman living in England who is a census specialist. He has done a fine job. About 5 million people were murdered, very, very close to it. And that was done by taking the official census of 1841 and then applying to it the correction factor created by a Captain Wynne, who made a count himself and found that the official count was off by more than 1/3. So it's been corrected by a specialist, and it's about 5 million. And it must be said that Cecil Woodham Smith had also found the same thing and referred to the same correction, but along with the rest of her burying her truths by the rest of her 400 and some pages in her book, having mentioned the truth about the recount the corrective recount of the population of Ireland, she then used the original, the official, the proven false numbers to do her calculation. And she came up with 2.5 million. Mm-hmm. But she only kept that number that low by using the uncorrected figures. And the uncorrected figures are in my book, and they're available to anyone. It's all spelled out there. Anyone can do their own checking.
Yeah, you mentioned a figure of 12 million in the census, in the earliest census.
Actually, there was never was that's what the corrected census would be: 12.7 or 12.8, 12,700,000, not far off 13 million, and that is anyone is invited to review the figures, go over the records themselves. And I must say, it is very comprehensive. This book is comprehensive. So one must accept that 5 million and perhaps more. The author of that particular chapter ends up saying, "Who can say that there weren't 6 million murdered?" And but mind you, I don't go with that very much. Not being able to prove something is not proof that it exists. But what the book does is, over half the book is comprised of exhibits, and the exhibits are placed there as evidence of a crime, in the legal sense, as evidence of crime. And it shows by year and by atrocity and by legal enactment, the 845-year duration of Britain's crimes in Ireland. And it shows that the Holocaust was the third of a series of peaks of genocide, first under Liz I, the second under Cromwell. And by the way, the use of the word Holocaust is not merely my opinion or my whim. I'm using it due to historical precedents. Scholars and anyone who wants to provide the record must refer to earlier records. And the earlier record is that Holocaust was used while it was ongoing in 1847. And it was used by Michael Davitt, one of the leaders in those who were trying to rectify the situation. He used it in his book, The Fall of Feudalism in Ireland, and so did many other writers, and I named them in my book. So what the book does, it demolishes the lie of potato famine by proving the existence of vast amounts of non-potato foods. The potato crops failed everywhere, but people died only in Ireland. Exhibit D in the book is, quote, the table of non-potato crop processors extant prior to the Holocaust by county, and then later by townland. The evidence of non-potato crops is comprised of Ireland's grain kilns and mills, flour mills, tuck mills, breweries, distilleries, threshers, livestock pounds, woolen mills, and windmills. They show the pages 340 to 374 of my book shows the locations in Ireland of each of these by county and then by townland. And my wife and I extracted them using magnifying glasses from the Ordnance Survey maps of Ireland, 1830, 1845. And anyone who might say, well, that was a few years prior to the Holocaust, in the grain mills that are shown on that map, 1830, 1845, in North County Galway, where we first moved in 1946, I worked in one of them, where my uncle was drying his grain in the local mill, his oats, and across the street from the mill, and he ground it in the mill across the road. And all of the mills shown on the Ordnance Survey maps were still operating in 1946. And so that's factual. Then, so the potato part of it is gone by showing the existence of all the processing mills, etc., of all the other kinds of food in Ireland. Then regarding famine, it demolishes the famine lie by proving the massive export of Irish foods. Exhibit B is a series of the London Times reports of weekly landings of Irish food in England. And so I used a number of those. I didn't take up too much of the book with those landings because that evidence is so abundantly available that I only used 4 or 5 examples of it, of newspaper clippings. And then It also demolishes my book also demolishes the quote famine unquote lie by proving the at gunpoint food removal. Exhibit A, the colored map, shows which British regiment starved which Irish district and names the location of some 170 of the mass graves they filled. Exhibit C names the immediate perpetrators of the Holocaust. Exhibit C1, the British Army regiments that removed the food and their provenances. And my source, by the way, for that is a disposition of the Army record from the British National Archives. It was, at the time, they were called the National Public Record Office. Exhibit 3 shows the landlord's militia regiments. The rest of the C exhibits quantify the other armed food removers, the constabulary, marines, warships, revenue police, coast guards, and their stations, to exhibit C6, the total number of armed British enforcers of the food removal. Exhibit 8 is a typical cess seizure by Army regiments, and C9 is a typical cess seizures by Army. And the source of both of those are the the War Office records and parliamentary papers. Cess, by the way, is a word that's gone out of use, except when I lived in Ireland. Bad cess to you. And it says it's a tax that was imposed usually by the Army. It started as an upkeep of its own army. The people being policed or being overridden were the ones who were forced to pay for the army that was oppressing them. Mm-hmm. So then, having demolished the quote potato unquote and quote famine unquote lies, the book refutes the new lie that it quote it was the rich Irish starving the poor Irish unquote. And this lie is of recent vintage. The famine writers adopted it once they could no longer deny the food exports amid starvation. So evidence that the landlords were English, not Irish, is Exhibit E, which provides their non-Irish family names, their English titles, their English clubs, English addresses, English schools, their British Army rankings, etc. Also the fact that mostly between 1900 and 1910, the British government repatriated them to England, leaving but a few remaining in Ireland on vastly reduced estates, such as the Duke of Devonshire and Lismore, and the heir of once Lord Brown in Westport. My great-grandfather Fogarty and family were evicted from their Ballykeely, Durrow County lease land in 1836 by Lord Ashbrook. Henry Flower was his actual name. My grandfather Fogarty was born on July 16, 1839, in a scalp, an emergency shelter in the shadow of that Lord's gallows near Durrow. And the current Lord Ashbrook, Michael L. W. Flower, lives on the Arley Hall estate in Cheshire, England. The vast sizes of their estates are shown on Exhibit 4. They list all of Ireland's 3,000-plus acre landlords, and the source of that information is The Great Landowners of Great Britain and Ireland, 1878. The book also names the famine writers, so-called famine writers. It marginalizes by focusing upon and refuting their fabrications. The relatively admirable and least deceptive of them all, Cecil Woodham Smith. So I both show all of the good work that Cecil Woodham Smith did in her so-called Great Hunger book, and also point out where she covered up her own statements of truth. It's very sad what was done there. And that part is chapter 11, the cover-up artists who kept the Holocaust, quote, perfect, unquote. So that's the background of the précis of the book itself. In Irish America, it's important to end the famine falsehood because it has always worked against the education of Irish American children. There's still an element of the old stupid Irish around. It's diminishing, but it's still there to a certain extent. And everyone who uses the word famine is promoting that notion of Irish stupidity. If people won't abandon the false word of famine in the interest of truth itself, and to stop bearing false witness against the murdered 5 million, they should do it, at least in Irish America, they should do it in order to give their children an even shot at academic qualification, academic admissions to good schools.
Yeah, it's Chris. The work that you've done is, as usual, when someone does the work to expose the truth of history in terms of what these supposed great powers have done in history. It's just absolutely, it's shocking. You know, I mean, the level of brutality and cynicism and, well, I can only call it pure evil of the British in Ireland is just, I mean, that one example you gave of where the people were being, who were being starved, where there were hundreds of tons of food, animals, livestock, grain being shipped out of the country over the period of these years, by under British military guard, and the local people who were being starved in this way were being forced to pay a tax to host the military that was taking the food away is just almost beyond belief, you know.
Yeah.
And the other,
when they couldn't pay, they were kicked out of their homes.
Yeah, and when they couldn't pay, they kicked out of their homes. And the other example of that that I got from your website as well is that when people were dispossessed, when they were thrown out of their homes because they couldn't pay their rent to their landlord who had stolen the land from them, and they were, you know, destitute essentially on the street. At that time there was a law passed as well by the British that anybody out after dark could be shot on sight. Anybody not in their house would be shot on sight. So you kick someone out of their house, burn their house down, put them on the street with their children, and then pass a law that says if you're on the street without a house, not in your home, we're going to shoot you. I mean, that...
Well, mind you, I'm not certain about the shooting, but they certainly could convict them of that and send them either into transportation to the colonies as a slave, or be sent to a workhouse where they were put at hard labor, but or execution. You're right, they could be executed, but not. I must say, I didn't think shot at sight, but they were the law, and therefore they were free to do whatever they wanted. And some of them, it's hard to believe, but some of them walked around. One of their taller, stronger members of the force would walk around, and his job would be to be the hangman. They carried around tripods with them to hang people from. But here's a man who would put a rope around someone's neck, put it over his shoulder, and then bend forward, strangling them over his back. This is shocking stuff. Shocking. Mm-hmm. And it went on before the Reformation, by the way. It cannot all be blamed upon the Reformation.
Right. There's a quote, I mean, just some of the quotes from English officials at the time are very indicative of the type of people that we're talking about. I mean, you quote one, Queen Victoria's economist, Nassau Senior. He expressed his fear that existing policies will not kill more than 1 million Irish in 1848, and that will scarcely be enough to do much good. 1 million dead will not be scarcely enough
to do much good. Yes.
Yeah.
So they wiped out the British government wiped out poverty in Ireland by murdering the poor, and they were poor because they had been robbed of their land. By the way, today,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that's a very psychopathic kind of view of problem solution, you know. I mean, there's all these poor people. Well, let's just kill them and then you won't have poor people anymore. No poverty.
Yes. Neat.
Amazing.
Yeah. There's to show you where we stand today, there's a priest who founded a parish in Florida, in Venice, Florida, on the West Coast, who, after reading my book and seeing my material, decided that he would like to put up a memorial, a monument, over the mass grave, nearest the Holocaust mass grave, nearest to his mother's birthplace in Northwest Mayo. So he contacted his cousins, with whom he has visited a few times over there, and he contacted the local monument maker, and he got no reply. And then wrote again, and this went on for a couple of years. But then finally, he heard back from his cousin that the parish priest has told him, all right, go ahead if you want to do it, but carve famine into that monument. Do not carve Holocaust or genocide. Now that's from the parish priest. And
why?
But however,
what's his problem?
Why is right? But and also, why is the monument maker going along with this? So there you have it, and that's in one of the major towns in Northwest Mayo. So the priest here is sort of stuck, and so far he has not been able to move forward. He has given them the wording for the monument. I've suggested that he send it to me, that I can maybe help in that regard. You see, I don't use murder on the memorials that my wife and I put up. I don't use the word murder. I just use the word. I name the regiments and their deeds. I name the regiments who stripped that particular area, and what they did. They moved the food, all the livestock and grains, etc., out of that area. For me, that's adequate. And to make an accusation or to use adjectives, it merely gilds the lily and is not even important, in my opinion.
It's not necessary.
It's sufficient. It's systematic extermination.
Do any of those regiments still exist, Chris?
Oh yes, of course.
Why not?
A lot of them have
let's go and put up some signs at their home bases in England. You know, a little bit of history outside their bases.
Yes. They're all, and one regiment came from America. At least its recruitment ground was America. They would be loyalists in America, which is kind of sad to think, because they were certainly persona non grata in the United States at the same time.
Yeah, I can imagine what kind of mentality you'd have to be a loyalist, a British loyalist in the U.S.
So soon after the War of Independence.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. By the way, even as we speak, the current pyre, P-Y-R-E, unburnt firing for the July 12th is already in Dervach, in northern Antrim, and it has many signs. It has big Irish tricolour flags on it with K-A-T on them, Kill All Tigers.
Yeah.
Last year in the same location, and these are all going to be burned, by the way. Last year at the same location, they had the same K-A-T, Kill All Tigers, and they had Pádraig McShane, Dead Man. At the very top on an Irish tricolour, Pádraig McShane, Dead Man. He's an elected councillor in that district of North County Antrim, and some months ago, in his absence, and he's got little children, his house was burned to the ground. So the effort to harm him, if not kill him, murder him, is ongoing today as we speak. While all of this is going on, the ex-Irish president, Mary McAleese, just visited the 6 counties during the week, where she participated in the opening of an Orange Museum. And she's calling for a unity of the Irish and the Loyalists. And you wonder, does she not know about the torture that's ongoing in Maghaberry today? Does she not know about the uncharged arrest and imprisonments? What is on her mind? Meanwhile, in this country, and by the way, the Orangemen have taken to flying the Stars and Bars, the Confederate flag of the, and they're doing that at a time when the Stars and Bars are being made illegal in the United States. Though it'll take a little bit of doing. There's plenty of bigots here yet, anti-black, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish to this day. But while they're being shamed here, while the KKK and the White Citizens Councils are being shamed in the United States, the ex-president of Ireland is suggesting that there be a reconciliation with their cousins, both in terms of blood and philosophy,
ideology,
in the North. How can that be? What's going on?
I may be a bit of an extremist, but the extent of the crimes against the Irish Catholic people by the British and their agents, which include the Orangemen and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, over the past several hundred years, are far too great for anybody at this point to be talking about, let's all just move on, because there can be no peace in any country without justice, and there can't be any justice without truth. The full truth of the situation has to be exposed. So when you have people like the former presidents of Ireland and other bigwigs, with these kind of platitudes and sanctimonious, paramoralistic kind of let's all be friends. I mean, those people should just be run out of town for the more or less quislings that they are. They're simply, I can't even listen to them.
Yeah, well, then you're in my opinion, your forces for great good. May you have power, and may you have widespread of your show. That's How long have you been doing this?
We're doing this for a couple of years now, but we have a website that's attached to that's been around for about 10 years. So yeah, we've been interviewing. You know, we do stuff on a broad range of topics, all of it focused on the truth about what's going on. I mean, you mentioned Anne Cadwallader earlier on in her book, Collusion. We're hoping that we're going to interview her in a couple of weeks' time. We hope she's on a speaking tour of Australia, but we're going to get her on, and she'll give us the kind of sordid details, you know, which is, a lot of people like to turn their face away from that kind of thing, but people can't. I mean, turning your face away from the reality of what the powers that be in this world do to people, do to ordinary people, isn't going to help anybody. It's not going to help to stop them doing that. You know, so those
either they're for terrorism or they're against it. And if they're going to be covering up her work, they're for terrorism. They're for murder, mass murder. Yeah. She names 120 Catholics who were murdered by the British, and by Catholic we really mean nationalists. Mm-hmm. They were not involved in any way with politics, or they weren't even necessarily Republicans. They were murdered because they were getting along pretty well, and that does not suit those who murdered them.
Well,
and 120, and that was just one gang alone.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was interesting. Another piece of information I came across in researching the so-called Troubles in the early 70s, or in the very late basically at the very beginning of the conflict. There was the original IRA, and at that time there were loyalist paramilitary groups, kind of who were forming themselves to protect their people. They were afraid of, you know, the propaganda. They were falling victim to the propaganda of the IRA coming to kill all the Protestants, etc. And at that point, there was a dialogue that was opened up between these loyalist Protestant organizations and the members of the original IRA, and the two groups realized that they had common interest. In terms of, because, you know, while the Catholics were brutally abused and discriminated against, the Protestant working class people also were having a kind of a hard time, albeit much less. But those two groups, Protestant Catholic, who would go on to be supposed arch enemies, there was a dialogue open between the original IRA and one of these loyalist groups, and once that had gone a little bit down the road, and they started to realize that they had common cause effectively against British rule in Northern Ireland, the leaders of those loyalist organizations who were engaging in had opened lines of communication, they were killed by the British. Now that to me said that the British had a very clear agenda. There would be no collaboration, no basically uniting of the people of Northern Ireland. They, at that point in time, had it very clear that they were going to have civil war, quote unquote, and this wasn't going to be a situation of British occupation of Northern Ireland. That can't be the problem. The problem has to be sectarian conflict, and they were determined at that time to create that sectarian conflict, and they did for the next 30 years. Yes. The British deliberately incited it.
That is an echo of what happened shortly after the American Revolution, when the Presbyterians in the North, who were still being discriminated against by the government and the government church, the so-called Church of Ireland, the Anglican Church, they were the dissidents of the time, so they led one of the risings in 1798. And it was, and they were all essentially wiped out, and there were a few heroes among them. The Shears, not south. The names escape me now, but they led it there. But that particular rising, the one in County Down in Antrim, has been written out of history. It no longer suits the power system. Because it was truth-based, and they even changed their names from militia to volunteers, in emulation of the volunteers of the United States.
Yeah, it was people against the elite, against the power elite, ordinary people, not divided but united against the corrupt elite.
Yes. By the way, elite is another word. It's really very, very common in the United States now. And I wish people would find a word to replace elite. Elite suggests the best.
But they're special.
Yes. So they're better than. They're superior to. What we have is a criminal operation, and we should refer to them as the criminals running our government.
Well said.
Criminals running our government.
Absolutely.
Not as an elite. They're not an elite. The elite in Ireland, in Ireland are in Portlaoise Prison or in Maghaberry or in a grave.
Absolutely.
They're Ireland's elite.
Absolutely. That's been true throughout history in many different countries, you know. Chris, I think we're gonna leave it there for this evening. It's been really great to talk to you, and I'm amazed at your energy and your drive to uncover this truth, because there's so few people who do that in the world today. Relatively speaking, there are very, very few. And on this one topic, it's great to have one person like you who is focused on that one topic and isn't afraid to go where the facts lead you and to try and expose that, because I mean, this world needs the truth more than anything right now, and more power to you.
I must say that there's an Irish printing of the book that is just now done last Friday, and it's available in Dublin through the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So anyone who wants a copy, anyone in Ireland who wants a copy of my book, they can look up the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and they can Google it or however they want to do it, and they can get a copy there. And anyone, if this is heard on this side of the Atlantic, the United States, they can call me at 312-664-7651. That's 312-664-7651, or Fogarty C, Fogartyc, Fogarty C for Chris Fogarty, Fogarty C at att.net. And I want to thank you for this time, and we're comrades. We're both working for the same goal. Yes, there's a few. I'd like you to contact me otherwise, because I'm in touch with a number. For example, 2 in Germany and other places who are very well informed, and there should be a unity of people. They should be in communication with each other. If you hadn't reached out to me, I would not know that you exist, and that's a shame.
I know. That's what happens a lot, you know. So yeah, we'll do that. We've been in contact already, so we'll keep that going. And yeah, one suggestion was you should put I didn't see a link and an image for your book on your website.
Very good point. Very, very good. In fact, there are a few errors there. That book mentions some 70 or 72 or something number of regiments. I counted a couple twice, and I was also using information from the Public Record Office that's hard to read. My book has it exactly right. I must both make the corrections there and also, by the way, on that website, you'll see merely the barest of bones of the book. The book is comprehensive. I believe it's going to become the definitive work.
Absolutely, I hope it does. Well, your website is irishholocaust.org, and it's a good website title because it's easy and it's you don't have to spell it out. It's irishholocaust.org. Have you thought about getting your book on Amazon?
Yes, in fact, I have somebody working on an ebook right now.
Right, good.
It should happen very soon.
Right, because we'll do our best to promote it, and we'll maybe put a link to it up on our website and stuff, so that people can get access to it and know that it's there, you know, because really this information has to get out. Because it's not just about Ireland, what we're talking about here. This kind of thing has gone on around the world. It was under the British, you know, for several hundred years, but it seems that the US has kind of taken over, or took over during the last century. And it's happening to this day. And it's happening today.
Chris, we spoke to an Irish-American couple a couple of weeks back who were in Libya in 2011 when it was bombed by NATO. The figures they're getting there of the number dead is at least a tenth of the population was slaughtered in that bombing, which completely dwarfs the official figures, if there are even any. So this kind of thing is happening in fast forward motion right now.
It's got the same source and it's the same problem, and it's happened forever, and it needs to stop, you know.
Well, by the way, Mary and my wife and I have been spending only about 5 or 10% of my efforts on matters Irish. For the last 15 or so years, we have been working nearly all our time for justice and against war by Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So we have one of my signs has been picked up by TV and across the country, and it's "Stop Government Crimes" with blood drops dripping off the word government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good
So
job.
we recognize the situation, and we're very, very active already. But in order to stop current genocides and future ones, we should denounce all of them, and that's
Absolutely.
my book spells out. Yes.
It does indeed, and people should read it, and we're going to promote it. Chris, thanks a million, and long may you continue to do what you're doing. Thanks a million for coming on. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you both very, very much.
Okay,
You're a treasure. God bless you. Bye bye.
have a great evening. Bye.
Wow. Oh.
Amazing. So we're not going to stay on too much longer here, folks. The latest news, obviously, as probably people listening know, is that the Greek voters have rejected the bailout offer in a pretty comprehensive fashion. It's at least 62% no against the IMF. Trying to fleece and terrify the Greek people, and by implication everybody else on the planet. So that's good news. And obviously we'll have to wait and see where it goes after that, but that's the positive. Everybody can be happy, at least for a few hours, until we see what they pull out of the hat next. But yeah, go Greece.
Go Greece.
Where's my halloumi?
2 fingers to the Troika. There'll be people celebrating in Ireland tonight.
I'm going to get a
There have been protests everywhere in support of them.
absolutely. They haven't mentioned that in the news recently.
Of course not.
I mean,
Except for RT.
I mean, yeah, the mainstream media has been talking about, when they interview different people, they're saying, well, the Germans and the French and the Finnish and the Latvians and the Estonians, they don't want to pay for Greece's debt. They don't want their money to be taken. I mean,
As if they pay for...
but as if they do for a start. But secondly, there have been protests all across European cities in support of Greece. Against the IMF, but they just ignore this. The media is just so duplicitous and so egregiously and obviously lying and ignorant and just duplicitous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they don't even care anymore. It's just like people protest for Greece. The media tell you people are protesting against Greece. I mean, they just turn it on its head, and it's sickening. It makes me throw up. But I need to go and get some ouzo to.
We'll see now how much of that was all bluff. So I mean, the head of Martin Schulz, he's a Brussels quisling. He's a German current MEP. I think he's in charge of or chairman of the European Parliament at the moment. Anyway, Martin Schulz, he says, if it's going to be a no, that's it. Monday morning, Greeks need to crack open the drachma because they're out of the euro.
Yeah.
So we'll see now. That'll be a load of bluff because, as we've been discussing, Joe, they don't actually want Greece to leave. It's a bluff and a counter bluff. So Cyprus and the Greek government are saying, well, we've no interest in leaving the euro and the eurozone. They probably do.
Yeah.
And Brussels is saying, well, if you vote no, that's it, you're out of here.
Yeah.
But they want them to stay.
Absolutely. It's kind of like, I used an analogy I posted on Facebook today. It's basically like an abusive husband saying to his abused wife who is planning to leave, who's realizing that this is an abusive situation and this guy's an asshole, and she's planning to leave, and the husband, seeing this happen, is saying, you're going to regret it, you better not go, you're no good on your own, you're pathetic, it's going to go horrible for you if you leave this house, if you leave me, And
if you leave me, that's it.
That's it. Well, not just that's it, but yeah, exactly, that's it, it's all over. And what the abused wife has to do in that situation is remind herself of the abuse, of the lies, and of the history, and just stick to their guns and don't fall prey to the emotional manipulation and propaganda. And that's what's been going on for the past several weeks, and it seems like the Greek people have stuck to their guns, and more part of them. I mean, thank God somebody somewhere has some sense in this effed up world. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show, folks. Thanks to Chris again. Chris is great. We love him. We're going to have him back on and see what else he's been up to, I think, because
he's just, this guy's got to be, he says in his bio,
I wish I had. What?
he's a great-granddad or something.
Yeah.
He says in his bio, we didn't get to ask him about it, but that he served in the U.S. Army in France around the time, I guess, shortly after World War II.
Yeah.
He's done all of this work in his retirement.
Yeah.
He must be pushing 90.
I don't know.
We didn't get to ask him about it.
Not asking. Well, that's
phenomenal. That's not
giving many more years than he has, though. We don't want to be.
No, well, we don't want to. But, that's astonishing. And he's just a fountain of information.
Yeah, that is great. He shows he's experienced, and he has a history there, and he has experiences that show the kind of the way these intel agencies and state actors and state agents work against people, and how
they reach over to Chicago.
The insidiousness of them, I mean, they're all over the place. I mean, the Anglo-American Empire, that's what it's been for a long time, and they don't brook anyone messing with their plans for control of absolutely everything and everybody, and anybody comes along and tries to...
Including history.
Yeah, anybody comes along and exposes the truth, because, I mean, there's a continuous line. It's the same thing. What the Brits are doing today in Syria, Brits and the Americans are doing today in Syria, funding ISIS, starting civil wars all over the place. I mean, that's, and basically slaughtering people, hundreds of thousands of people like they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a continuous line back to Ireland, a continuous line back to 300, 400, 500 years ago. It's the same mentality, the same type of people all the way along are doing exactly the same thing, and the details of that are very enlightening.
Extremely, like this, his insight into the peace process in Northern Ireland. On its own, what is it? Just a small thing.
Everybody's out in the street cheering for the peace process and stuff, and they don't realise it's completely manufactured.
But the geopolitical context of it was that
the Brits wanted...
They knew what was coming. 9/11, war on terror.
Right. So let's wrap this one up. They could have wrapped it up years ago before thousands of people were slaughtered by British death squads in Northern Ireland. But no, we want to slaughter thousands of people with our death squads because that's fun to these psychos in power. So we keep that going. At any time we could have just had a peace process and wrapped it up. But we wanted to keep it going, and the Brits, they probably would have liked to keep Northern Ireland going as a training ground for their military to go over and shoot some civilians here and there. They enjoy doing that kind of thing. The Brits would have liked to keep that going, but the Big Brother America came in and said, listen, we've got a bigger deal coming down the pipeline here. It's called the War on Terror. It's got the whole Islamic terrorism thing. We're going to invade lots of countries, and we need you to back us up, Mr. Blair. So get with the peace process in Northern Ireland, free up your military, free up your resources for elsewhere. We're done here,
And that psycho is lauded for his contribution to the peace process, blah, blah, blah.
I'd sling him up as quick as look at him. Anyway, one day, someone else will do it. The universe will take care of him. God, Muhammad, Buddha, Superman, I don't know. Somebody will take care of him. Anyway, folks, we'll leave it there for this week. We hope you enjoyed the show, and thanks again to Chris. And check out his website, Irish Holocaust. There's not a lot of stuff on it, but it's very interesting. And check out his book as well. We're going to buy a copy to have it on hand. Anybody with any Irish roots there has a duty to have this kind of information for posterity, for your children, for your grandchildren. So
we'll be returning to Irish Affairs in a couple of weeks, but next week we're speaking with scientist John Casey.
Maybe. We don't know yet. If not, they'll be speaking to us, or we'll be speaking to each other. So until then, have a good one.
See you next week.